Okay, simple summary for week 2. The way this assignment works is I will tell you a story, and basically you repeat it back to me. You write a 1 paragraph long summary of these events that I'm discussing, and you answer the questions. And it's kind of an AI resistant thing, I admit that, but it's also, it allows me to gauge your understanding and your comprehension. And also, telling somebody a story is a way of engaging in history that maybe facts and figures don't do. Okay, so today's simple summary is about Theodore Roosevelt. And there have been a number of people, there have been over 40 people that have served as president of the United States. I would venture to guess that this one is the most dynamic person. I'll tell you a story about who Theodore Roosevelt is. I haven't ridden horses in a long time, but let's say you're riding along on horseback one day in through thick brush, and you come along, you hear something in the brush, and all of a sudden a mountain lion leaps out at you. What do? I think most people, they probably freak out, or they maybe try to run away, or they try to ride off on the horse, or they fall off the horse and hit their head and die. I don't know what you do, but what Theodore Roosevelt did in that circumstance was to reach to his side on the scabbard on his side and withdraw a knife and leap off the horse and stab the mountain lion to death. That gives you a tiny idea of who we're talking about here. I don't mean that he was violent. I mean, what I'm trying to say is he sort of leaped into life that way. The second story I would tell you is that he was a sickly young man. He was skinny, he had bad eyesight, he had the glasses that everybody calls you Four Eyes, and your name's Theodore, so he's not exactly super charming anyway. And he went to the doctor, and the doctor told him, Theodore, you have a weak heart. You are going to have to live a calm and sedate life if you want to live a long life. And even at this young age, Roosevelt said, Doctor, I appreciate it, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to live the life that I want to live, and if it's shorter, then oh well. And that's exactly what he did. He, in his own words, quote, rose like a rocket. He finished college at a young age. He married at a young age. He had children at a young age. He went into politics at a young age. He did all of these things, and he endured tragedy. His father died while he was at Harvard. His first wife, Alice, passed away. Actually, here, let me pause and tell you this story. Theodore Roosevelt's wife and mother died in the same house on the same day, 1 floor above. His wife died of complications from child's birth, and his mother died from a disease the same day. That's the kind of heartbreak that he had to endure. And it really could have been like a great movie, because afterwards, this wealthy industrial young man from New York, he's heartbroken by this, and he leaves his baby daughter with his sister, and he travels out west and becomes a rancher, becomes a cowboy, and he sort of heals himself in that wilderness area. And then he comes back and he reclaims his daughter, and he marries his former sweetheart, and they have a big family, and he goes off and sort of conquers the world. He held various jobs in government, increasing levels of responsibility even as a relatively young man. And in 1898, when the United States went to war with Spain, Roosevelt organized a group of a volunteer regiment. I don't know why I can't talk. A volunteer regiment that became known as the Rough Riders. And he wasn't the leader of the Rough Riders. He was actually the number 2 person, but he's remembered as the leader of the Rough Riders because really he was. And he became a war hero when the Rough Riders were dispatched to Spain. He led a charge up a hill in a classic battle sense, not really fearing the bullets whizzing around him. Became a national hero as a result of that, and that plus his previous service in government as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, as a police commissioner in New York City. He was elected governor of New York that fall, And 2 years later, he became the vice president of the United States, which at the time is kind of a political death sentence. You didn't want to be vice president. But, I mean, dog's making noise, but the sort of cynical way of putting it is, well, you are one heartbeat away from the presidency. Or as John Adams said, he was the first vice president. I am vice president, and in this job, I am nothing, but I may be everything. So in September of 1901, Vice President Roosevelt was vacationing with his family when President William McKinley was shot by an assassin. And within about a week, Roosevelt became president of the United States at the age of 42, which, I get it, to you sounds like a million years old, but 42 is the youngest president in the history of the United States, younger than Kennedy, younger than Obama, anybody. And he changed the nature of what it meant to be president. Presidents to that point, with a few exceptions, Lincoln being a big one, and Lincoln was a hero of Roosevelt, by the way. I don't want to say they were managers, but they didn't exercise as much leadership as presidents do now. It was Roosevelt who caused people to expect that. He was younger, he was more vigorous, he was bolder, and so he pushed things. I'm going to leave it to the lecture to talk about policy. I wanted you to understand the person. And he did make a terrible political mistake in 1904 after being elected. He's like, oh, you know what? I essentially will have served 2 terms, because he had almost all of McKinley's term. And so he promised not to run again. And he kept that promise, even though at the Republican convention in 1908, the delegates were not cheering for Taft the day of the nominations. They were cheering for Roosevelt. They were chanting. They were chanting Teddy. And by the way, yes, Theodore Roosevelt is where teddy bears come from. Long story, not as good as the substance of it. So Roosevelt left office. Taft was elected, and Roosevelt went off on another safari and tried to stay out of Taft's way. But it was probably inevitable that he would want to come back. He was too young to retire. And he didn't agree with some of the things that Taft did, so he ran against him in 1912. And when you have 2 Republicans running against each other, 2 major Republicans like that on the fall ballot, I'm talking about, not for the nomination. I've already explained this in the lecture. All you're going to do is elect the Democrat. And so that's what happened. Taft and Roosevelt split the vote. Wilson, the Democrat, was elected. And a lot of Republicans never forgave Theodore Roosevelt for this. And so 4 years later, when the Republicans were looking for a nominee, nobody called him. He hoped to get a phone call, and he didn't. The last few years of his life were sad. As I said, he lived his life at full speed, but what that meant is he basically wore his body out. And so he started to have a lot of physical problems. When the United States went to war in World War I, even though he was obviously too old and not in good enough health, he went to the White House and saw the president and asked to be allowed to enlist in the army, which is crazy. And of course, the president was like, no. Quentin Roosevelt, his son, did enlist and was killed in the war. That was another sadness that he endured. But a lot of the hard feelings had faded. And so by around 1918, people were like, you know what, maybe Teddy in 1920. He would, after all, only be 60 years old. But that was not to be. In January of 1919, January 6th, to be exact, Theodore Roosevelt died in his sleep in his home in Oyster Bay, New York, and he was laid to rest in the family cemetery nearby, and that essentially concludes his story. So I think I'll just wrap it up there. I've went on a little longer. I'm looking at 9:33 here already, that I wanted this to be a little shorter. Write up a summary, tell me what you think about this person, and answer the questions and turn it in, and we'll go from there. Thanks.